Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to Africa.
Hmm.
It's a continent that's becoming more and more important in global affairs.
Absolutely.
And especially, we're going to be looking at the U.S.-China rivalry that's really starting to heat up there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic, isn't it?
It is, and it's something I think that's particularly interesting to
Yeah.
anyone who is interested in international relations. And especially, if you're preparing for the UPSC exam, this is the kind of geopolitical chess match
Yeah.
that you really need to understand because it
Yeah.
can shape the world.
It really can. You've got these two superpowers kind of vying for influence
Yeah.
in a continent that is just absolutely ripe with potential.
Right.
China has been there for quite a while now, very strategically investing, pushing the Belt and Road Initiative. And now the US is starting to say,
Right.
okay, wait a minute, we need to up our game here,
Right.
especially under the Biden administration. And
Yeah.
who knows what could happen with a potential Trump 2.0. Or
That's a whole other
another layer to this.
enormous.
But
Yeah.
before we get too far, let's just kind of anchor ourselves
Okay.
with a recent event that I think really kicked things into high gear.
Okay.
And that was President Biden's visit to Angola,
Yes.
his first trip to Africa as president, and just packed with meaning, I thought.
Yeah, it was significant. It was a lot more than just him checking off a campaign promise.
Right.
This really signaled a very tangible shift in how the U.S. approaching its engagement with Africa.
I'm curious about the choice of Angola specifically.
Yeah.
It's not exactly known for being a beacon of democracy.
Right.
Why go there first?
I think that's where the strategy gets really interesting because by
Right.
picking Angola, which is a one-party state,
Yeah,
over what would normally be considered a more presentable democracy,
right.
I think it demonstrates that they're more focused on practical gains over ideology. It's kind of like a way of saying, look, we're willing to play by different rules here
Right.
to counter China's influence.
So countering China's influence, even if it means partnering with governments that have
Well, see,
questionable human rights records.
it appears so.
Okay.
And Angola is an important piece, on the geopolitical chessboard here.
Yeah.
I mean, vast oil reserves, strategic location, they're actually a major oil supplier to China,
Wow.
which further underscores why both these superpowers are so invested in this country.
Control the resources, control the game. Kind of a classic play there. But what are the concrete actions that the U.S. is taking to counter China? You mentioned a railway project earlier.
Yeah, the Libido Corridor.
Yeah.
So it's this massive U.S.-backed railway project that's going to cut right through Angola and connect to both Zambia
Wow.
and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So kind of a counter move to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but with the U.S. backing.
Yeah, you got to. This is a direct challenge to China's infrastructure dominance in the region. And it's worth noting that right before Biden's visit, Angola intentionally skipped a major China-Africa summit,
Really?
sending a pretty clear signal.
Yeah, I talk about making a statement, but
Yeah.
let's bring in the elephant, or maybe the former elephant in the room here,
Okay,
Donald Trump.
right.
If he were to secure a second term, could we see a complete reversal in U.S.-Africa relations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, his first term was
It was a little rocky.
turbulent, to say
Yeah.
the least.
Yeah.
We saw those controversial remarks about African nations, the travel ban impacting several countries,
just-
attempts to cut aid, although thankfully Congress blocked those.
Yeah, it was definitely a rocky period. So why would a second term be any different? What's changed?
Well, I think the key factor here is the escalating competition with China, especially for these resources that are going to be so crucial to future technologies.
Right.
We're talking about things like copper cobalt, essential for battery production,
Yeah.
which, by the way, the DRC has in abundance.
So this need for resources may just force Trump to rethink his Africa strategy.
So pragmatism might win out over ideology again, even in a Trump administration.
It's certainly a possibility. Plus, you can't ignore Trump's history of engaging with authoritarian leaders.
Right.
He might find it easier to work with certain African governments,
Right.
regardless of their democratic credentials, if it aligns with U.S. interests.
Right. So it sounds like a potential Trump 2.0 might be more engaged with Africa,
Yeah.
but maybe not for the most altruistic reasons. Feels very transactional.
That's a fair assessment, but it's important to acknowledge that China's approach has been pretty transactional as well.
You're talking about that no strings attached aid.
Exactly.
That's got to be appealing to some African leaders.
Well, sure, on the surface, it sounds like a great deal, right?
Yeah, easy money.
China invests heavily in infrastructure projects, particularly through its Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
And they don't impose these demands for political reform or lecture about human rights.
Right. But I'm guessing there's more to the story. What are the potential downsides of this no-strings-attached approach? What's the catch?
Well, the criticism is that it often comes with a hidden cost.
Okay.
For example, Angola now owes China a staggering $17 billion.
Wow.
That's a hefty chunk of their national debt, around 40%, in fact.
That's a serious burden. It sounds like a recipe for trouble down the road.
Exactly. And that's where this debt trap diplomacy argument comes into play.
Yeah.
The concern is that China is intentionally burdening these countries with loans that they know they can't repay,
Right.
creating leverage for political influence and extracting concessions down the line.
Mm-hmm.
This is causing a lot of concern globally, and it potentially opens a door for the U.S. to offer a different, more sustainable model of development.
So the U.S. could position itself as the good guy in this scenario, offering aid without the risk of crushing debt.
Potentially.
But what would that actually look like?
Yeah.
What kind of concessions might China be seeking, and how would the U.S. approach things differently?
Those are all excellent questions.
Yeah.
And they lead us to some of the deeper complexities of this rivalry.
Okay.
But we're going to dive into those in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds like a good cliffhanger.
Yeah.
We'll be back in just a moment to unpack those details, so don't go anywhere.
Definitely not.
And if you're finding this discussion insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives
Yes.
on topics that matter. We'll see you in part 2.
Absolutely. So picking up where we left off, let's dig a little deeper into this whole debt trap diplomacy thing and what it actually means, because, there are very strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be a point of contention in this.
It is.
In this whole U.S.-China dynamic in Africa.
Yeah.
So what's your take on it?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that it's not always a black and white situation.
Okay.
There are definitely instances where Chinese loans have been used very effectively to develop infrastructure to boost economic growth in African countries.
Right.
However, concerns arise when we start to see a pattern of these loans leading to unsustainable debt burdens.
Right.
And it raises questions about transparency, responsible lending practices, and potential ulterior motives.
So while infrastructure development sounds good on the surface, there might be longer-term consequences if a country just can't manage the debt it takes on.
Exactly. That's where the idea of a trap comes in, right? Critics argue that China could leverage this debt to gain access to strategic resources, to secure political support, or even to gain control of key infrastructure.
You mentioned earlier that China often seeks concessions in exchange for this investment. Can you kind of elaborate on what those concessions might be? What is China really after here?
Well, it really varies from case to case.
Okay.
But some common examples would be things like preferential access to natural resources, support for China's foreign policy positions in international forums, and even, the leasing or outright ownership of strategic infrastructure.
Wow.
Like ports or airports.
So this raises the question of how the U.S. could offer a different, perhaps more sustainable model. What would that actually look like in practice?
Well,
what concrete steps could the U.S. take to counter China's influence without falling into the same traps?
One key difference is that Western lending institutions, often backed by the U.S., typically place a greater emphasis on things like transparency, good governance, environmental and social safeguards. They also tend to offer more favorable loan terms with lower interest rates and longer repayment periods.
So it's not just about the amount of money being offered.
Exactly.
It's also about the conditions attached to those loans.
It's the fine print, right?
Exactly.
So the U.S. could leverage its economic and diplomatic clout to promote responsible investment practices, support good governance initiatives, and offer technical assistance to help African countries manage their debt and negotiate fairer deals.
It's interesting how this rivalry is playing out on multiple levels, economic, political, even ideological. We've talked about infrastructure and resources, but there's also this battle for hearts and minds happening.
Oh, yeah.
China has been very active in promoting its culture and values in Africa through programs like Confucius Institutes, media partnerships, cultural exchanges. They're really presenting themselves as a model for development and a friend to the developing world.
So is this approach working?
Well,
are African perceptions of China changing?
I think there's no doubt that their efforts are having an impact.
Okay.
Public opinion polls actually show a growing awareness of China and its influence across the African continent. A lot of Africans view China as a very valuable partner, particularly in terms of economic development
Right.
and infrastructure investment.
Right.
However, there's also a growing awareness of the potential downsides.
Right. Of China's involvement, such as concerns about debt sustainability,
Right.
labor practices, environmental impact.
So it's a mixed bag
Yeah.
with both positive and negative perceptions emerging.
Yeah.
How does the U.S. counter this soft power push?
Hmm.
Can Hollywood movies and American pop culture really compete with China's
Right.
more targeted approach?
Well, it's not just about entertainment.
Okay.
The U.S. has a very long history of engagement with Africa through educational and cultural exchange programs. Like, think about the Fulbright scholarships, the Peace Corps partnerships between American and African universities.
Right.
These programs really foster those people-to-people connections.
Yeah.
And they can have a lasting impact on perceptions and relationships.
It sounds like the focus is on building genuine relationships.
Yeah.
And fostering mutual understanding rather than just simply broadcasting messages or trying to outspend China.
I think that's a key distinction.
Right.
The U.S. can leverage its strengths in areas like higher education, technology, innovation to build these partnerships that benefit both sides. It's really about offering genuine collaboration and support rather than simply trying to counter China's every move.
This all feels very reminiscent of the Cold War
Right.
with the U.S. and another major power kind of vying for influence on a global stage.
Yeah,
But there's a key difference here, isn't there?
I think so.
We're not just talking about superpowers dictating terms.
Right.
The African people themselves have a voice
Absolutely.
and agency in shaping their own destiny.
I think that's a crucial point. It's really important to remember that Africa's not a passive bystander in this rivalry at all.
Right.
African nations are actively asserting their interests. They're seeking partnerships that align with their own development goals.
Right.
They're not simply pawns in some geopolitical chess game.
Yeah.
They're making strategic choices. They're negotiating deals that serve their own needs.
That makes this whole situation even more complex
It does.
and fascinating. It's not just a two-player game.
No.
There are multiple actors with their own agendas and ambitions.
It's a multidimensional chess match for sure.
It is.
And I think understanding those complexities is really crucial.
Yeah.
For anyone who wants to really grasp the dynamics that are at play in Africa today,
Right.
the choices that governments, businesses, individuals make are going to have a profound impact on the future of the continent
Right.
and indeed the world.
So let's shift gears for a moment and think about the broader implications of this rivalry. Why should someone listening to this,
Yeah.
perhaps on the other side of the globe, care about what's happening in Africa?
Okay.
How does this rivalry impact their lives?
That's a great question. And here's why it matters. Africa is a continent on the rise. It has a young, dynamic population, abundant natural resources, and enormous potential for growth.
Right.
What happens in Africa is going to have ripple effects across the globe.
Right.
It's going to impact everything from global trade to climate change to migration patterns.
So it's not just about helping Africa. It's about recognizing that our fates are intertwined.
Exactly. We live in an interconnected world.
Right.
And understanding the dynamics that are at play in Africa
Yeah.
is essential for anyone who wants to be an informed global citizen.
It's clear that external forces are playing a significant role in shaping Africa's future.
Yeah.
But what about the voices and the agency of Africans themselves?
Right.
How can we ensure that their perspectives are heard and their needs are met?
Well, I think it starts with listening.
Yeah.
We need to support African-led initiatives,
Right.
partner with local communities, recognize the diversity and complexity of the continent. You know, too often Western media portrays Africa
Right.
through a very simplistic, often negative lens focusing on conflict, poverty, disease.
Yeah.
We need to move beyond those outdated stereotypes and acknowledge the agency and resilience of African people.
So it's about seeing Africa not as a problem to be solved,
Yeah.
but as a partner to collaborate with, as a place of innovation,
Exactly.
creativity, and opportunity.
And that shift in perspective, I think, is really essential if we want to build truly equitable and mutually beneficial relationships.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation.
Thank you.
It's clear that the U.S.-China rivalry in Africa is a complex and multifaceted issue
It is.
with far-reaching implications.
Yeah.
But beyond the geopolitics and the power plays,
Right.
there's a human story here.
Absolutely.
A story about people striving for a better future, navigating a rapidly changing world, and seeking partnerships that respect their agency and dignity.
Beautifully put. And that human story is ultimately what matters most.
For listeners who want to engage with this topic further,
Yeah.
what are some resources or actions they could explore? How can we as individuals contribute to a more informed and nuanced understanding of Africa and its place in the world?
Well, there are so many ways to get involved.
Okay.
You can support organizations that are working on the ground in Africa. Educate yourself about the continent's history and cultures. Connect with African communities in your own city or online, and challenge those harmful stereotypes whenever you encounter them.
These are all great suggestions. It's about taking action, both big and small, to foster understanding and solidarity.
Exactly.
And for our UPSC aspirants, this deep dive is a goldmine of information relevant to your international relations studies.
The dynamics we've discussed today are so central to understanding the evolving global landscape.
This has been a fascinating journey, and we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But there's still so much to explore.
There is.
We'll be back in a moment for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into some key takeaways and offer some final thoughts on this complex and ever-evolving rivalry.
Sounds good.
Don't go anywhere.
Okay.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, looking at this U.S.-China rivalry in Africa. It's a complex issue.
Absolutely.
Well, lots of different factors at play. Economic, political, cultural.
It's a reminder, I think, that global affairs are rarely simple or straightforward. You know, there are always these multiple layers of motivations and interests and consequences.
As we wrap up our discussion, I wonder if we can kind of distill some key takeaways for our listeners.
Okay.
What are the most important things for them to keep in mind as they continue to kind of learn about this rivalry and its implications?
Well, one key takeaway, I think, is that this isn't a zero-sum game.
Okay.
You know, while competition between the U.S. and China is definitely there, there's also room for cooperation and collaboration, especially when it comes to addressing those shared challenges like climate change, poverty, and disease.
So it's not about picking sides. It's about finding that common ground and working together towards solutions that benefit everybody involved.
Yeah. Another crucial takeaway, I think, is the importance of African agency. You know, African nations are not passive bystanders in this rivalry. They're active players with their own interests, priorities, and strategies. It's really essential to recognize their role in shaping the continent's future and to support their efforts to achieve sustainable development on their own terms.
You know, we've talked about the importance of understanding the nuances of this rivalry and moving beyond those simplistic narratives. For listeners who want to stay informed and engaged, what advice would you give them? How can they navigate the abundance of information out there and develop a more informed perspective?
Well, I think it's crucial to seek out diverse perspectives, to read beyond the headlines and be critical of the information that you're consuming. Don't just rely on one source or one perspective. Look for analysis from African scholars, journalists, policymakers to get a more balanced and comprehensive view.
So it's about being an active and discerning consumer of information.
Absolutely.
Constantly questioning assumptions and seeking out multiple viewpoints.
Exactly. And, you know, don't underestimate the power of personal connections if you have the opportunity. Engage with African communities, learn about their cultures, and build those bridges of understanding. These personal experiences can be incredibly enriching and can really help to break down stereotypes and foster genuine empathy.
It's a reminder that learning about global affairs isn't just about reading books and articles. It's about connecting with people, listening to their stories, and broadening our understanding of the world through shared experiences.
Well said. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our actions have consequences, and that we have a shared responsibility to create a more just equitable and sustainable world.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. And I hope that our listeners will continue to explore this topic and engage with the complexities of global affairs.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like and subscribe for more insightful discussions on topics that matter. We'll be back soon with another episode, so stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
And until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging yourself to see the world from different perspectives.